welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by a friend of the show. This is a third visit, which is such a great honor for me. We've talked about two other absolutely fascinating and beautiful translations, and we are here to talk about a third. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so happy to be back. This is Jeffrey Angles, and I'm a professor at Western Michigan University and a translator of Japanese literature. So, yeah, we're here today to talk about my new translation, The Luminous Fairies and Mothra, by three writers, Shin Ichiro Nakamura, Takehiko Fukunaga, and Yoshie Hotta. And this was the book that was the inspiration for the 1961 film Mothra.
Mm. It's so interesting. The first time that you were here, we talked about your translation of Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again, which was so interesting. And now
Thank
we are
you.
back. Oh, you're so welcome. And now we are back with this one. My first question is, did you always know that there was going to be more Godzilla translating in the works, or did that come as a result of the first volume?
Yeah, no, definitely the latter.
Mm.
So, when the Godzilla novellas from the 1950s were translated, and the news came out on the internet that oh, this book is going to be forthcoming from University of Minnesota Press, a whole bunch of people, fans from I guess all over, wrote to University of Minnesota Press and said, "Gosh, we hope that you'll do the novel that the film Mothra is based on next." And so, I think that Godzilla had just come out about the time that the editor contacted me and said, "Hey, Jeffrey, we're getting all these requests for another book. Do you happen to know anything about this Mothra novel? And would you be interested in working on it?" And I think I took all of about 10 seconds to say yes. Please let me work on this. Absolutely. So yeah, so this is definitely an outgrowth of the first project.
Very cool. And you can see, I think between the stories, you can see some similarities in the themes and plot points, but it's also so different.
Hmm.
Mostly in
Yeah.
terms of the structure. The structure of this novella is so interesting. So can you talk about a little bit about your encounter with it and yeah, what struck you about it?
Yeah, so I was really intrigued by this book because it was the basis for the movie. So the movie came along in 1961, in the middle of the year. But this novel or novella, I should say, was commissioned by Toho Studios in preparation for the movie. So Toho Studios knew that they wanted to do another big monster movie, but they didn't quite know what it looked like. And so they contacted the authors of this book and asked them to come up with a script. And so they came up with a novella, which then became the basis of the movie. So I was intrigued by this because I wondered what the now very famous character Mothra, the monster Mothra, looked like before, like in her earliest conception. Like, what did she look like when people were first imagining her? And what did it look like? How did that change when it got to the screen? So I was really intrigued by this. I was a little bit surprised to realize that it was written not by a single author, but by three authors. That's an unusual thing. The way that the story was written was Toho Studios asked the main author, and then I'm not quite sure what that main author said to Toho Studios to bring two other people onto the project. We don't unfortunately have a lot of good records about that, but we do know that he brought along a couple of writers, and so it ended up being three of them. So one guy wrote the beginning portion, person wrote the middle section, and another person wrote the final section. And I think that may have to do with the idea that they had early on that they wanted to use an insect as the main protagonist, or main monster in this film. It's interesting to watch something like a moth undergo transformations on screen because it means you get to use a whole bunch of different special effects. You get to use a whole bunch of different things, but the kind of metamorphosis of the character, I think, allows space for different people to write the different sections of that story. Perhaps a little bit more than if it was just the same, entity from beginning to end. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
So,
absolutely. Was
yeah.
that a concern of yours while translating? Because something that I think you do very well is that you actually capture their three different voices very well, because they do have slightly
Oh,
different tones, and like
yeah.
some have a little bit more humor than others. Like, was that something that was central to your translating?
Absolutely. So actually, I'm really happy that you said that because that's one of my main goals. When I work as a translator, I really want to try to figure out what's interesting and unique about each writer's voice. And so I think that there's almost nothing worse that you can say to a translator than like, "Oh my God, everything sounded the same." So, so I'm really glad that the three different authors who worked on this, their voices came across. Yeah, no, I really did want to showcase what a weird and quirky project this was. When I realized that this was such a strange and funny project with three different people working on it, I began to really think about, well, who are these three people? How are they different? What are their individual interests? Because, the more I looked into who these three authors were, it really became clear to me that each one of their sections of the book reflected their own personal interests. Like, for instance, the second guy, the person who wrote the middle section, his name was Fukunaga. When Fukunaga wrote the second section, he included a long section about the creation myth of Mothra and the creation myth behind the island that Mothra comes from. And he was a person who was himself quite interested in comparative mythology, and he was interested in sort of making sure that his own work, his other work written in Japanese, kind of would resonate with a sort of international vibe. I think he was very concerned. He didn't want to be just a solely inward looking Japanese author. And so that comes through loud and clear in his section where he writes this kind of interesting world mythology and creation story. Um, the third author, the one who wrote the final section, his name was Hotta. Um, and he was a very, very, very politically oriented fellow. He was very, very involved in a lot of kind of important political concerns of Japan in the mid 20th century. He was really very strongly involved in the non-alignment movement and the Cold War. The idea that, like, countries other than the United States and the USSR should, not necessarily just glom onto the superpowers for protection, but they should go their own route and, try to form their own alliances. And so he seems to have been kind of one of the major forces behind the idea and the story that the Japanese people help out the people of the small, decolonizing new territory of infant islands. And so the whole idea of kind of helping out the people of infant islands will be good for Japan and good for the world comes from his own very specific political views. So I really wanted to kind of showcase that. I wanted to try to make sure that we understood that these three authors were all interesting folks, with their own agendas and their own interests, their own styles. And I just didn't want to bulldozer over all of that in translation. So that's part of the reason I wrote such a long afterword to this book, because I really wanted to showcase, who these people were, what their motivations were, and so on.
And I think that the themes that you've just been talking about relate in really interesting ways to, I hope I say it right, Rosilica. Is that like the political entity, the sort of the US, USSR stand-in?
That's right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So fascinating to
Good.
me. And I'd love if you could sort of talk a little bit more about like how the way that the US is depicted is very, very interesting to me. And it of course
Yeah.
is like a super vital era for like US Japan relations. So can you maybe talk
Right.
about like how that context shapes this sort of like fictional but very familiar political entity that we have here?
Oh, great. I'm so happy that you asked this question because I thought about this a lot as I was working on this. Yeah, so to make this clear for people who haven't read the book yet, in the story, Japan is interacting with a very, very large, important superpower of a nation, which is called Rusilica. In the film, this country was renamed and called Rolisica, but anyway. But the point is that in the book and in the movie, the two countries, the two major superpowers of the time, Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States, America, Russia, America, their two names were kind of taken and put together to make a portmanteau, like a new word made out of the names of the two countries. In Japanese, it's Roshirika from Russia and America. And so this, you know, the characters from the country of Rusilica in the book are kind of overbearing. They push Japan around. They tell Japan what to do. Japan feels a little bit weak. It needs to rely upon the superpowers, but that doesn't go so well in the course of the book. And the whole purpose of that was that the writers of this book, and probably especially the third writer in particular, Hotta, had this strong belief that that Japan should not just align itself with the big superpowers. During the 1950s, it became very the world was dividing into camps. In the real world, some countries were following the United States, some were following the Soviet Union, and making alliances with one side or the other. But there's a lot of people in Japan who felt very worried about that situation. Japan is not very far away from the Soviet Union, and there were American troops that were stationed in Japan. So the Japanese were very, very keenly aware of as the rhetoric of the Cold War got hotter and hotter, and people began to worry about war, and especially nuclear war, a lot of people worried in Japan, like, oh my God, the fact that we're so strongly aligned with one of these superpowers means that it's very likely that if any conflict ever broke out, Japan would be dragged into it necessarily. We couldn't escape. And so there was a strong voice, a strong group in the Japanese population in the late 1950s who said, like, hold on a second, let's not align with either power. Let's figure out our own route. Maybe we, as a kind of non-superpower nation ourselves, could do better aligning ourselves with other non-superpower, like the newly decolonizing countries of Asia, of Africa, of the Pacific, and so on. So in a way, this whole story about Japanese scientists helping out the people of Infant Island, coming to their aid when their hero Mothra is under attack, all of that clearly reflects this Cold War ideology of the 1950s. I should mention that this book, the novella, came out right at the beginning of 1961. And so all of these kind of conflicts about where Japan should align itself during the Cold War came to a head in the year 1960. There was a series of protests in Japan saying that that Japan should not align itself with the superpowers. And these were called the Ampo protests. And they swelled and swelled over the course of 1960 until the point where I think it was in mid-1960, there was something like 6.4 million people across the country on strike over this issue. So the largest protest that Japan has ever seen in its history about where it should be aligned. And so the authors themselves participated in those protests. They were very aware of these protests. And so they tried to figure out a way that they could work these political concerns into their text. So it's a deeply political text, even though it's, a fun, interesting monster story that we can just enjoy on the surface level. There's also this kind of interesting undercurrent to what's going on there too. That's not necessarily terribly obvious at first glance. But, I think the more that we think about those things, the more interesting this book becomes.
100%. And as somebody who has only really become familiar with like Cold War history through the perspective of the US, where everything is painted as very like clash of civilizations, like this two diametrically opposed cultures, to sort of like step outside the US view and see this Japanese image of like looking at the US and the Soviet Union and being like, they're the same picture, like is a really different, fascinating, like perspective to sort of counter like how the wars taught to us here.
Oh, good, good. Right, right. I think that especially after the end of the Cold War, it's very easy to come out of that and say like, oh gosh, the US won the Cold War, oh, that was inevitable or something like that. But, for people who are actually living through that time, this is a grave existential question. Like, what do we do? Like, aligning ourselves one way or the other might determine the entire future of our nation, might even determine the entire future of the world. So these are really big, serious concerns. And I love the fact that by reading Mothra, we can come and revisit some of these concerns.
Absolutely. Oh, so I have a question about Mothra
Yeah.
herself. You make some really fascinating points in the essay about obviously like the moth imagery and all of the associations that we bring from that, but also Mothra as mother, which
Hmm.
was so interesting to me. So can you talk a little bit about that and maybe like yeah, the gendered aspects and maybe how that relates to some of the, environmentalist messages in the book?
Oh boy, that's a lot of questions
It
right
is,
there
I'm
in one.
sorry.
No, 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 I love it. I love it. You're giving me all sorts of good food for thought. Yeah, so maybe I'll start with saying a few things about the way that people have traditionally thought about Mothra. So when the 1961 movie came out, and of course that was based on the novella that I've just translated. When that movie was then shipped abroad to the United States and re-released here in this country, all of the subtitles that came out with that first edition describe Mothra using the feminine pronoun she, her. And so, right from the beginning, at least within the English-speaking world, Mothra was gendered as female. But and as you watch, if you're a fan of the Godzilla movies, as maybe some listeners might be, you'll kind of know that as the movies develop, Godzilla and Mothra kind of become a pair that has sometimes they clash with each other, but sometimes they cooperate with each other. And I think that the common way of describing them is kind of like a sort of Godzilla is the male, you know, angry guy who tromps across the landscapes, causing havoc, whereas Mothra is more the kind of benevolent, protecting, feminine force who helps to kind of counterbalance, Godzilla's, outrage and so on. So there's a way that they're kind of almost thought of as like a yin yang dichotomous pair. But at least one of the things that was interesting about translating the book, though, was that I realized that that wasn't necessarily the idea from the very beginning. When I started translating the book, I was surprised to find that there were no, for a long time, there were no pronouns whatsoever used to describe Mothra. And up until I think maybe more than two-thirds of the way through the book. And so in Japanese, that's very easy to do. In Japanese, you don't have to use pronouns all the time like we have to use in English. So it's very, very, very easy to avoid gendered language. So, there's no necessarily need even in Japanese to determine what Mothra's gender might be. But much to my surprise, in around two-thirds of the way through the book, there's a funny little passage where the word he is used to refer to Mothra in the in the larva stage. And I was like, what? What's going on here? Like suddenly there's no pronouns, and then suddenly, here's a handful of male pronouns. And then almost immediately after they appear, they disappear for the entire rest of the novel. And so I was like, hold on a second, this doesn't gel at all with the subsequent image that we have as of Mothra as being a kind of feminine, protective, almost motherly figure. Um, I I suspect that the writers may have had that kind of feminine image in mind. The word Mothra sounds very similar to the English word mother, and just switching a couple of letters and changing to one vowel, it's very similar. So I think that was in the back of their head somehow, um, but they didn't necessarily make it terribly explicit in the text itself. And so, I began thinking about like, well, what should I do as a translator, with this? And so in the very first part where Mothra's like, in sort of the egg stage, it's very easy to get away with avoiding the gender problem altogether by calling Mothra it, you know. But then when I get to this male pronouns, what do? I didn't want to whitewash over those because they're in the text. But then I also recognize that, that almost all discourse in English describes Mothra as a female character. And in fact, Mothra is so beloved by many, 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 many people for exactly that reason, kind of that she is this, beautiful, lovely, nice looking on screen, also kind. Um, Benevolent figure. So, I wanted to make a nod to that. And I also realized through some transgender friends that Mothra is a very much a transgender hero. A lot of people kind of look to Mothra as a sort of role model or, kind of an expression that speaks to them from the screen. And so, I really wanted to honor that, especially in their age when transgender bodies and identities are so much under attack by forces out there in society. So I really wanted Mothra to be the transgender kaiju hero that I think is there. So although that's not super obvious in the book, I decided to kind of bring that out on my translation a little bit.
Hmm.
So by using female pronouns in the last part of the book, to make it clear that Mothra had gone through some transformations. Since Mothra does go through transformations over the course of the book, I figured gender could just be one more of those transformations.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so lovely. And it's a fascinating sort of look into how the mythology of Mothra has sort of developed. And there's something
Yeah.
interesting about the book too, since it so explicitly is written with the movie in mind. You get like a lot of
Uh-huh.
sort of, if it were a TV show, you'd kind of call it like early installment weirdness, where stuff hadn't become canon yet and they're playing.
Yes, yes. Definitely. One of the things that's really interesting about this book is, there's a lot of stuff that's not in the movie. Like, there's long descriptions of places and people and their interactions and stuff like towards the early part of the book. But then when we get to the scenes that people remember from the movie, like the action scenes, which are long and drawn out and take up, more than half of the movie, those are relatively short in the novella version. And at first, I was a little bit surprised by that. But then, as I thought about it, I realized it made sense because, after all, the authors of this book knew that Toho Studios was going to take the story and do whatever they wanted, in those exciting action scenes. So they just didn't write in too much detail, so they could just leave it all up to the special effects director. So yeah, so you're totally right. Like the way that the novel novella kind of corresponds to the film, some parts are more fleshed out in the novella, some parts are more fleshed out in the film, and it's really interesting the way that those sometimes don't align perfectly. But I think it makes it really interesting. I love the fact that the film and the book are so different because it will give fans a lot to talk about, I hope.
Absolutely. And it makes for very different tones, because I think when you're reading the book, you focus so much more on this sort of like the sense of awe and wonder and almost reverence, or like rather than the fear parts, the destruction parts. It's a
Mm,
really interesting, like while a story could have the same beats, just like by how you time things and what you focus on, you can have such a different mood and such a different message.
absolutely, absolutely.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So what is next for you? Is
Oh,
there more Godzilla in the future? Are you translating other things for a while?
yeah, so gosh, that's a good question. So I'm I'm in between projects at the moment. I do have some things that I have my eye on and some things that I'm trying to get the rights to work on. But nothing has I haven't quite nailed down the next project yet. So I'm excited to think about that. There's been such a nice response to the Godzilla translations, and it seems like people are very interested in Luminous Fairies and Mothra, judging from the number of pre-orders of the book. Um, I I have a secret fantasy. Maybe it's not so secret because I've talked about it in a couple of podcasts like this one. But I do have a secret fantasy, not so secret anymore, about doing an anthology of big monster stories from Japan. Because we have lots of ghost stories from Japan. We have lots of stories about yokai, these funny shape-shifting monsters from Japan. But there's actually a lot of good writing out there related to big monsters. Godzilla was the first major breakthrough in that. But after Godzilla came out, a number of writers, some writing for Toho Studios, some writing for themselves, started writing stories about big monsters. And so there's actually a lot of literature about kaiju, about big monsters in Japanese, and much of it has not, seen the light of day in English. I'm thinking of one particular novel. I'm hoping someone out there might might hear this and they'd be interested in publishing it. But there was a writer, a mystery writer by the name of Miyuki Miyabe, who wrote a book that became a bestseller in the United States called All She Was Worth. A magnificent, magnificent piece of mystery writing. I can't recommend it highly enough. Riveting from beginning to end. But she's best known as a mystery writer, but she's also written an amazing novel that was set in the 1700s, in which a gigantic monster makes its way across northeastern Japan and destroys the country. And so it's a beautiful look at Japanese history by a fantastic first-rate storyteller. So the book in Japanese is called Kojin, the Wild God, and I would be thrilled to translate that. Considering that some of her books have become bestsellers in the US before, I'm hoping that I can find some publisher who wants to do this with me.
Oh my gosh. Well, I really hope you do too, because that sounds fascinating and it's absolutely a story I'd like to read. So
Oh, thank you.
thank you so much for sharing your time and your book with us. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks so much for having me back. It's lovely to connect with you again.
Thanks. Okay, listeners, you have homework now. Please check out The Luminous Fairies and Mothra. Please check it out so that we get to read this next book, and whatever you want to translate, I will be here for. So let's make
Oh,
this happen.
excellent.
All
Oh,
right,
thank you so much, Jen.
you're so welcome. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.